Molly, I've got to say Bath is awash with walks, with guided tours, both commercial and free. What more can yours add to that?
The walks focus on the history, the social history of dying and death, and also crime in the city. You're quite right, we're very lucky here in Bath. We have lots of wonderful walks, some guided for free by Mayor's Guides, for example, some commercial. Sometimes they look at a specific theme. I went on a fantastic Frankenstein walk relatively recently. But this looks at another side of the city's history, essentially. So it looks at the experience of ordinary working people and how they related to mortality, and it also looks at some of the causes of death in the city. I think it's fair to say that we often highlight the beautiful architecture and the Georgian connection, and now with the popularity of things like Bridgerton and Jane Austen's anniversary this year, so that sort of beautiful, pretty, flouncy side of the city is emphasised quite rightly in walks and tourism guides. So these two walks look at a kind of seamier underbelly of the city, if you will.
Well, I was going to say sex, crime and death sell, really, don't they?
They do. Years and years ago when I was at school, a history teacher said to me then, if you want anyone to read what you write about sex or death, then of course the two are also intimately related with each other, as the walk shows, for example. So the walk deals at one stop with the history of sexually transmitted diseases in the city, because this was a tourism city, a place of pleasure and leisure. There was also a thriving sex industry, and sex industry could result in some fairly horrible diseases which could terminate one's life in rather unpleasant ways.
Where is that stop?
There's a stop near the Bell pub on Walcott Street, and that was one of many hostelries in the city from which working women used to ply their trade. So, but also around the river Avon, there's a famous quotation that the ladies who walked the streets of Bath were the nymphs of Avon Street, which is a rather romanticised way of describing women who were sex workers.
Well, Ladies' Mead House, which is, I think, the stop in Walcott Street you're referring to, that was the sort of place where ladies of the street were taken in and given respectable jobs like washing laundry, weren't they?
Yes, that's where young women, either considered to be at risk of falling into a life of vice — I'm using the language of the time, I'm not personally judgmental about these things — they might be plucked off the streets and taken to work there and trained in laundry and domestic skills for employment in respectable homes in the city.
Well, certainly there's an awful lot of laundry to wash with all the visitors we got during the season. Now look, we're stopped by Rebecca's Fountain, and that's a stop on your podcast walk, but most walks stop here and talk about Rebecca, so what have you found out that they don't know?
Well, I use Rebecca sort of metaphorically, so you have to sort of ride the wave with me on this one. This is a temperance fountain, so the temperance movement wanted to discourage the consumption of alcohol. So this stop has kind of two folds depending on which walk you're doing. Partly it's to look at the history of water supply in the city, because water supply was terrible for most people. Most houses obviously in the past didn't have piped water. People bought water from 7 private water cellars here in the city. For poorer people, they often relied on the river to get their water supplies, and that was and the river also, as you can imagine, who says we learn from history, we have problems with polluted rivers now, but obviously the water always also took high levels of sewage and waste and God knows what. In 1832, Bath was afflicted with cholera. So the stop at Rebecca Fountain talks about the coming of the cholera. The first lady who died of cholera in the city in 1832, in July 1832, was a ribbon seller. And she'd gone off to Bristol for the day, selling her things, came back in the evening and felt terribly ill and was dead within 24 hours. So the stop here explores the city's response to cholera. Of course, it was a rather ambivalent response. The national government wanted local authorities like Bath to start gathering statistics for how many people were getting sick, and to open hospitals and to think about burial grounds and so on for the disease, for those that died of the disease. Bath was a tourist town that relied on water, partly, to sort of sell its services, because people came here for the cure and the famous spring waters. So the response of the authorities here in Bath was a little ambivalent and possibly a little less than honest about the numbers of people who got sick in the city.
Now, I suppose if water wasn't safe, one very popular drink, which I think was a lot cheaper years ago than it is today, was gin?
Yes, gin. Gin has a strong connection with the city, as it, again, as a tourist and leisure city, and a huge number of drinking establishments were here, so people didn't just come to take the waters, they also came to have fun and to drink alcohol. Just round the corner, Orange Grove is named for the Orange family, the Dutch royal family. Now, gin really took off in Britain when William and Mary ascended the throne. William was Dutch, and he was really keen to promote Dutch products here in the UK, and one of those was Geneva gin. And he was backed in this by a very strong farming lobby because they could sell some of their inferior grain to gin stills. So the gin craze gripped Bath like it did many other cities. It was a huge moral panic in the 18th century. You might be familiar with the Hogarth print, Gin Lane.
Yes.
It shows a woman who's clearly very, very drunk, sort of dropping her baby out of her arms, and people sort of sprawled on dirty straw, absolutely sort of wasted on gin. However, it's understandable, you know, working life was hard and brutal, and people's homes were often overcrowded and dirty and cold. You know, one can understand the desire for a bit of escapism with gin. One of the big problems with gin also was the number of illegal stills, gin stills, that were making sort of moonshine gin, as it were, often using, you know, sort of terrible products, you know, sort of acid and things, and using rose water to cover the flavour. So of course they were quite physically dangerous to risk unlicensed gin. And again, we don't know how many people actually died of drinking gin, but if you imagine that people were perhaps less well nourished in the past, the effect of alcohol on the system would have been even more than it is, you know, on a sort of modern healthy body. So a terribly, terribly big moral panic ensued, leading eventually to the passing of the Beer Act in 1830 by King William, which means King William is actually the most popular royal name for a pub, because he passed the Beer Act and he kind of made licensing a lot easier to sort of move the population to drinking beer and try and ease them off gin.
So you really do know your stuff. Now look, this whole podcast thing has originated from a department in the University of Bath that I've never heard of before, and it's all to do with death.
Yes, absolutely. We have the Centre for Death and Society at the University of Bath. This year, part of the reason we did the podcast is that this year is its 20th anniversary. So this was part of a number of activities that we've been doing to sort of celebrate the research and the research that exists in this city. I mean, both universities, I think, are wonderful assets to the city. And the Centre for Death and Society is a truly interdisciplinary centre. So it has people, my background is history, for example, but has people who work in healthcare, palliative care, sociology, policy, economics. So it's a genuinely interdisciplinary centre. People come together to develop research projects and to share their research. And many of the talks are available online. So if people are interested in finding out more about the centre, if you Google Centre for Death and Society Bath, it will pop up and you can see some of the many interesting online talks where people share their research.
I will put the details at the end of this interview. It's getting noisier because where are we now? I think we're about 10:15, and just to interrupt you, Molly, briefly, there's the tour bus, the toot bus, setting off. I don't think I would like to sit upstairs. It's too cold today for that. So I'll just let that pass, and the University of Bath that we were talking about, their bus is just arriving. No queue of students today. And when it's quieter, I can move on to something else which you are personally involved in, because I think you've just seen the publication of a book you've written entitled No Ordinary Deaths, The History of Mortality. Now, I don't think death is something people particularly like talking about. Are they going to queue up to buy your book?
I have no idea. I hope so. If I may be shameless for a moment, I really hope people will. It looks at a social history of dying and death. So A lot of death history deals with the rich and the famous and the powerful, for the very obvious reason that it's more straightforward sometimes to research them. They left wills and testaments and had accounts of their lives. So the book is very consciously about how ordinary people experience dying and death, how they coped, how they prepared psychologically and practically, how they paid for funerals, how they organised funerals, and concepts also of the afterlife, so what people anticipated might happen to them after death. So it sort of covers it's not a linear history, it's thematically organised as a book. So it looks at these different areas: preparing for death, caring for the body, the funeral, and so on. So I very much hope people will buy it.
No, actually, seriously, it sounds fascinating, but maybe it's quite ironic that we're standing here with Bath Abbey behind us, because some would argue we live in a pretty godless society now, that death is being swept under the carpet. I mean, it's getting very popular now with cremations, that you have the cremation quickly and privately and cheaply, well, cheaper than it would be if you had a full funeral. Then you have some sort of celebration afterwards. Do you see major changes in our attitude to death and mortality now?
I think our attitudes towards dying and death have changed. They've always changed. I don't think there were ever kind of fixed points, where everybody thought or behaved or believed in the same thing. So, for example, if you take death rituals, they're often really, really local. What they do in one village might be completely different from what they do in the next village, for example. I think we do talk about death. I think we're just evolving the way in which we talk about it. So perhaps Church of England numbers, attendees have dropped off or kind of lessened over the years. But for example, lots of people are interested in different forms of spirituality these days, and they reflect that in their practices and the choices that they make after death. So, for example, a lot of people these days for a green burial, a shroud in a kind of organic meadow or something like that. Ironically, in the 19th century, that would have been considered a pauper burial, whereas I think now it's a sort of rather fashionable bourgeois choice. But I think that's a sort of spiritual investment in the future. That's a sort of, I want to tread lightly, I want to leave no trace. So I think whilst the sort of classic interpretation of religion might not be quite such a powerful presence, I think other ways that people express their spirituality are just as present.
Well, thinking all the way back to the funeral of Princess Diana and people throwing flowers on the hearse, and then suddenly you hear people applauding when the coffin goes by. A new way of acknowledging death. It's a fascinating subject.
It's a fascinating subject, and as I say, our relationship changes with the times. So industrialisation, the rise of capitalism, for example, made funerals much more elaborate. In the 18th century, they would have been relatively simple apart from the very wealthiest in society. But by the 19th century, mass production means that even quite ordinary household budgets could afford quite an elaborate funeral, coaches and horses and black fabric and things like that. So things adapt according to the times and the market and the kind of growth of cultures of consumption as well.
It really is fascinating stuff, and I could stand here and let you talk for hours, but that's very cruel because it's cold and windy on this corner. Let's let you get a plug in. The book. You've got a book signing, and I think you're giving a talk at Toppings coming up soon. When is that?
That's right, yes. I'm doing a talk at Toppings on the 15th of May in the evening, and then on the 11th of June, I'm doing a talk at Arnosvale Cemetery in Bristol. And Arnosvale is just a marvellous place. If you haven't visited, whether you come to the talk or not, I recommend to your viewers that you pay a visit, because it's absolutely fascinating.
Having worked next door to it for many years, referring to our location as the dead centre, I'll agree with you. Now, quickly, going back to this walk, or walks, and the podcasts, they are available on which site? I mean, I'll put the details at the end of this interview.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, they're available. You can download them onto your phone, whatever make of phone you have, and they're on cdaswalk.org, CDASwalk, all one word, .org. And if you have any difficulty finding it there, if you just go onto the Centre for Death and Society, that will kind of guide you to the walk as well.
And I think there's some hope that there might be physical walks at some point on this subject.
Absolutely, yes, we're happy to be approached. If I'm available, I'm really happy to guide walks. I actually really enjoy the interaction with people who want to come on the walks. So again, you can contact the Centre for Deaf and Society and we can see if we can sort you out or offer small guided groups.